In the latter half of Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, Henry Hill talks about his Pittsburgh Connection, who supplied his illegal narcotics. But who exactly was involved in the Pittsburgh Connection? Let's check it out. Welcome to OC Shorts, bringing you detailed historical snapshots of the American Mafia and other organised crime. Feel free to subscribe if you like that sort of thing. Today, I will be discussing the infamous Pittsburgh Connection with mob historian Paul Hodos, author of the excellent book Steel City Mafia. In both the movie Goodfellas and the book Wise Guy that the film is based on, Lucchese crime family mob associate Henry Hill ends up trafficking narcotics, firstly in prison and then after he is released. He was receiving his drugs from what he called the Pittsburgh Connection. In Scorsese's Goodfellas, Henry Hill's Pittsburgh Connection is portrayed by veteran mob movie actor Paul Herman. Although listed as dealer in the credits, it can be said that this character is based on an individual called Paul Mazzei. And Maisie was being supplied by a colourful Pittsburgh mobster by the name of Eugene Nick The Blade Gesuale. Before we look at Nick the Blade, the man ultimately behind the Pittsburgh Connection, I spoke with Paul Hodos, author of the excellent book Steel City Mafia, who provided some further information on Paul Mazzei.
He was kind of a lower level associate of the Pittsburgh family, but he was around for quite a while. One of the earlier incidents that are attributed to him by law enforcement and appeared in a big trial that happened in Pittsburgh in 1990. Paul Mazzei was alleged to have been in on basically a bank robbery with the future underboss of the family, a guy whose name is Chucky Porter. So he knew some of the people who would become bigger players in the Pittsburgh family later on after the 60s. At the time, Porter was just an associate too, but a well-regarded one. And the fact that Paul Mazzei was doing jobs with him, I think, says a lot that he was accepted into the fold of the associates there. But he was into the illegal gambling business, into the drug business, obviously. That's why he's famous from the movie. He was associated with, as we said before, Eugene Nick The Blade Gesuale. Not much else is known about him really in the public record. A few tidbits here and there from human sources I've talked to as well. But someone who was involved in a few different things, but never became a major player.
I think in the book Goodfellas or Wise Guy, was he actually locked up with Henry Hill at one point?
Yes. So in the 1970s, they were both in prison together. Paul Mazzei and Henry Hill were, allegedly involved in the drug business even inside the prison walls. That's something that they cover in the movie a little bit too. And when Hill got out in, I believe it was 1978, he hooked back up with Paul Mazzei, and that's how they got the Pittsburgh Connection going.
As mentioned, the main man behind the Pittsburgh Connection was a wild mobster by the name of Eugene Nick The Blade Gesuale, not to be confused with Nick The Blade Gesuale from Philadelphia. What do we know about this gangster's early life and criminal career?
He was born in from 1940 to 1943. The sources disagree on that. He was born in the Pittsburgh area. It's a neighborhood called Larocca. That was an Italian neighborhood at one point. It really isn't anymore. There's really only one Italian business from that time period in that neighborhood. But Larocca Avenue is where many of the Pittsburgh gangsters grew up. It was kind of Pittsburgh's Little Italy, along with places like Bloomfield. And it was a tough place to grow up, especially if you were hanging around the guys that Gesuale hung around. And he got involved in the rackets, I'd say, in probably the early 60s at the earliest, maybe the late 50s as a kid. There was an interesting little article in it was either Pittsburgh Press or Pittsburgh Post Gazette from the 50s that showed him boxing with another kid when he was younger. Looked like he was about like 12 or 13. And what's interesting about that is that he did carry over that love of boxing into later in life. Not that he became like a professional or anything like that, but that was something him and future Pittsburgh boss Michael Genovese had in common. They were both very much into boxing. But Gesuale starts to appear on the scene, like I said, in the 60s. He was running a club, a gambling club for Mike Genovese in that old neighborhood, Larimer. And he was close to him as a result of that, but he was part of this group of young guys that John Larocca, who was the boss from the 1950s to the early 1980s, and Mike Genovese, who was variously described as somebody high up. He acted as the acting boss. He was consigliere for a time. So just generally a high up guy from the 1950s onwards. And Gesuale was acquainted with him because he was part of this group of young toughs that were really the next generation of the family. The family would put these guys into these different gambling clubs. They would be bartenders, bouncers, help out with the games that they ran out of there, help out with numbers, and sometimes just work at regular jobs for part of the time because Pittsburgh was always concerned to have that sort of establish that legitimate income look. So those guys were working at the car washes for the family, working at used car dealerships, working at hotels, things like that. They were actually employees, and they would show up and do some of that work. It wasn't a complete no-show job. Obviously, a lot of times it was, but sometimes they would actually get down and do that grunt work, and I think Gesuale probably did that as well. Um, so rumor on the street has it, and this is not uh, this was one of law enforcement's theories about Gesuale. It's something that I didn't get to put into the book, but a little behind the scenes info. There was an associate named Alphonse Morano in 1967 who, just like Gesuale, was part of those young tough guys, and he was really instrumental, unfortunately for him, in introducing an undercover IRS agent to the family. And as a result, a lot of their illegal gambling clubs got raided. And he had according to FBI documents, he had a confrontation with Mike Genovese, who accused him of lying, and basically was very angry about the whole situation. And according to FBI informants, him and possibly Larocca ordered that Alphonse Morano be killed because he lied and because he introduced this IRS agent to the family. Nobody was ever prosecuted for the murder, but some sources say that Gesuale, who was not convicted of this, but they say that he was the shooter and that's how he made his bones, if you want to call it that. Um, and this Morano was basically found slumped over in a car on the side of a rural road with 3 bullets in his head. No one was ever convicted for that. And then in the early 70s, Gesuale was implicated in a Lebanese heroin importation scheme. And he was eventually, that case was thrown out. But a lot of times that he was arrested, there was a judge who said that the reason he was never convicted is because he would simply threaten witnesses. And one of the incidents that I found in the book was somebody had accused him of assault, and he sort of drove up on them, tried to hit them with his car. He missed. The guy jumped out of the way. He jumped out, tried to stab him with a knife. He is called Nick the Blade, so he was supposedly good with a blade. And then he fired his gun at him, purposely missing, basically to intimidate him, and said, you better not testify against me. And the guy did not. But he was notoriously violent, very, very much of a hothead. John Larocca once said about him when asked, like, "Hey, why do you let this guy hang around you?" And he was like, "Well, he's so wild, he keeps the heat off of the rest of the guys." And I got a chuckle out of that too. And that was the way they viewed him. He was very loyal. He was a good enforcer. He made money. and he kept his mouth shut. And so when you put all those things together, he was a good associate to have around. I personally believe, and other people who are in the know think, that the reason that he was never made is because he was a little bit too wild. And Pittsburgh always like their guys to sort of stay under control. You can have that streak, but just know when to let it out. Don't do it all the time.
Eugene Zizwali was described by law enforcement as crude, violent, and reckless. And at one point, an FBI agent witnessed him urinating off a balcony while snorting cocaine. However, despite such behaviour, he was favoured by the Pittsburgh family's hierarchy, people like Mike Genovese and Charles Porter, presumably because he made them a lot of money, and he also knew how to keep his mouth shut. Paul Hodos expands on this further.
And him and Porter, especially because Porter was much more into the drug trade as well, were definitely piece in a pod. Porter was obviously calmer and more well thought out about things, but I even have a picture in the book with those two guys come together coming out of the Beacon Club, which was kind of Gesuale's headquarters in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh. They would do loan sharking and drugs and prostitution out of there, and use the club's phones for business and things like that. And yeah, so he was very flashy. He had fancy cars, Jaguar, Rolls Royce. He had a penthouse apartment. He flashed cash all around town, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars during his the height of his career, which was in like the early '80s when he was involved in the cocaine business. And he was very arrogant too, according to people who knew him. And he had monogrammed clothes, including his underwear, apparently.
And the monogrammed NTB, Nick the Blade.
NTB, yes. So he liked the name Nick the Blade, and that nickname came from two incidents that had occurred earlier in his life, and that I believe in the '60s and '70s. One where he threatened a guy who was, I think, trying to hit on his girlfriend, and I'm forgetting the other dispute, but they were solved basically with a knife, and that's where that nickname came from. And yeah, he was a super colorful character and somebody that they trusted a lot. It's just that I just don't think they liked his antics, but they were willing to put up with it.
You mentioned in your book that he got himself into a dispute with members of the Pagan Motorcycle Club, and I think it was Chucky Porter had to step in and kind of smooth things out. Can you expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, sure. So one of the allies of the Pittsburgh family, off and on, was the Pagans' motorcycle gang, and Gesuale was the connection to them in the drug business, and so one of the leaders of the Pagans chapter owed Gesuale some money because he was had bought some cocaine off of him and was selling it for the group that was kind of under Gesuale operating from him. And so this dispute elevated, and I guess he didn't want to pay the money. And Porter at the time wasn't yet an underboss, but he was already somebody who was viewed as a trusted individual, somebody who would resolve disputes, someone who was diplomatic, somebody whose people from the Pagans and from the Mafia circles would trust. And so they hashed it out in Porter's house, and basically Porter ruled in Gesuale's favor, which was not super surprising because he was his mentor in organized crime, kind of, and he was also getting a piece of Gesuale's action too. So if I was the Pagans, I don't know if I would have been too happy with that, but they seemed to accept it. And later on, they still had a pretty close relationship and were doing business together with the drugs. Later on, they used some gems that they gave to Gesuale for collateral on some of their debts too. And then, he ended up going to prison. So the inference was that money basically disappeared and Gesuale pocketed it.
You mentioned in your book another good story with Nick the Blade, where he got himself into trouble again but this time for robbing a courier of drugs and gold, who was trafficking for one of the New York families. And again, this obviously had to be ironed out, I assume, with Chucky Porter again.
Chucky Porter, that was one of the things he was very good at, was interfamily relations too. He would collect payments and deal with some other families on business. There was kind of a famous meeting between him and Nicky Scarfo where he represented the family. So he was good at that, and there aren't too many more details on that incident, unfortunately. I couldn't find too much except for the bare details, like which New York family and all that. It's something I'm still hunting down post book as well because I'm interested. But that just shows you Gesuale's personality. You know, he kind of flies off the handle and does something like that, and then Porter has to come in and fix it. And I think Porter was probably okay with fixing it because once again, Gesuale was making them a lot of money, and he did have some respect in New York too. There was one bit of information that Gesuale had a prostitution ring actually in Manhattan that he controlled, and that I was just recently given some background on that, and it was where this human source that I'm talking to, who wishes to remain anonymous, basically said that was something where Gesuale wanted to have this business in Manhattan, and obviously you need permission from New York, and that the hierarchy of Pittsburgh talked to Vincent Gigante, the Chin, and basically got him that permission. And you know, as long as he was kicking up some of his profits to that family, it seemed like everything was okay.
So, who was supplying Nick The Blade Gesuale with his narcotics?
If you go back from Gesuale, there is a gentleman named Helmer Sandini down in Florida, who was actually an FBI informant for other cases, but was not telling them about this sort of drug business he had going on up in Pennsylvania. And he was supplied by the Colombians. So that's kind of how the chain worked. And then there was also, very interestingly, and I do mention this in the book, an undercover agent named Daniel Mitrione, an undercover FBI agent who was working with Helmer Sandini, you know, trying to infiltrate his drug network. But he ended up, unfortunately, and this is a very rare instance, I'd say, basically turning on the bureau and on law enforcement just generally, and becoming a drug trafficker with Helmer Sandini, and you know, making money, and not disclosing that to his employer. So that was one of the things that J. Edgar Hoover was worried about when he had his agents go after the mob was, hey, these guys are pretty rich and they like to spread their money around. You know, some of my agents are probably going to get corrupted. And
yeah,
unfortunately, this one did.
Eugene Zizwali's downfall started in January 1985 when he was indicted as being a key player in a drug ring. He then went on the run down to the Caribbean, but it was his luxury lifestyle that tipped off the authorities to his whereabouts.
He ran to Jamaica, like you said. He was on the lam for a while, and he had to move a few times while he was in Jamaica. From what I understand, the U.S. Marshals were kind of on his tail, but one of the things that tipped him off in the final round just before they got him was that there were only reportedly 2 TV satellite dishes in Jamaica at that time, so it was kind of a rare thing down there at that time. And one of them was at a hotel, I think, and the other one was owned by Gesuale, and it was a dead giveaway because he just couldn't be away from the action for too long. So he loved betting on basketball and other sports too, and he had to have it. And so that ended up being his downfall, and Jamaican authorities eventually arrested him at the airport, meeting with another cocaine trafficker, and they turned him over to U.S. authorities right after that.
And then obviously in 1986, he was sentenced to a massive 45 years. Is that right?
Yeah, it was 1986. And
what did I say? Did I not say that?
I think you said 96.
Oh, yeah, no, 1986, yeah. Let's just do that again for the purpose of the video.
Okay, sure.
That's all right. And so, obviously, the following year, in 1986, he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. That's correct?
Yes, yes. And they tried to get him to turn against his the hierarchy because they knew how close he was to them. He refused to do that multiple times, from what I understand. And he served out his time, and he eventually got out in 2014 because of all the threats he had made against people who were prosecuting him, including law enforcement and judges and things like that. He was basically banned from living in Pittsburgh after he got out, which I've never heard of happening before in my life. And he moved down to Florida. His family had kept one of the few luxury items that wasn't seized in the 80s, a Rolls Royce, and so that he got that back, this 1980s Rolls Royce vintage one. And he lived down in Florida for like about a year and a half. And he would frequent this bar in Ormond Beach called Pastimes, which seems appropriate because his glory days really were behind him at that point. And he would go there all the time, like daily, and get a glass of wine. And in 2016, that's what he was doing. He was sipping a glass of wine and taking a phone call from one of his friends back in Pennsylvania. And he dropped dead from a heart attack.
Paul, your book Steel City Mafia includes a wealth of information on the likes of Nick The Blade Gesuale and many others. Tell us a bit more about what readers can expect to learn regarding the Pittsburgh's Cosa Nostra crime family.
So this is really the first book on the Pittsburgh Mafia ever in its totality. People have written books about Youngstown, Ohio, which was where one of the crews were, and Wheeling, which is where one of the crews were. But nobody ever really connected all the dots. And what readers will get is an exciting story. The subtitle is Blood Betrayal and Pittsburgh's Last Dawn. It's the story of the last generation of the Pittsburgh Mafia, which is, in my opinion, now defunct. And the excitement and the many downfalls, the prosecutions, murders, and the drugs, the gambling, and all that happened in the key period from the 70s to the early 2000s when they were truly active. And you'll get the story of Mike Genovese and Gesuale and Porter, very colorful characters that are not well known. And I guarantee you that, especially if you're not from Pittsburgh, even if you are from Pittsburgh, you're going to learn something new. It's a family that is more like a modern mafia family. Secrecy was the top of what they were trying to do. And I think they were a little ahead of their time with some of how they used intermediaries rather than, in-person meetings and things like that. Gesuale maybe wasn't as careful, but his bosses were.
For all those interested in checking out Steel City Mafia by Paul Hodos, a book I thoroughly recommend, then I've added a link to the book in the comments below. I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching.